Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending Wiscape's fourth event in our Higher Education Finance series. Today's program is Confronting Student Debt. Is income-based repayment a good option? My name is Noel Radomski, the director of Wiscape. As you can see, we have a great panel today, and we hope to have a lively discussion following their presentations. If you already haven't done so, please sign in the table out in the hallway so you can get more updates on future programs. Also, you'll notice a couple of our panelists authored a Wiscape policy brief that just came out titled A Primer on Income-Related Student Loan Repayment in the United States. Please help yourself to a copy. First, today we'll hear from our invited speakers, and then we'll open up discussion among the panelists, as well as Q&A from the audience. Let me introduce our distinguished panelists. First, we have U.S. Representative Tom Petri, representing Wisconsin's 6th Congressional District, and he is currently serving his 18th term in the United States House of Representatives. He is a member of both the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee and the Committee on Education and the Workforce. He is the current chairman of the Highways and Transit Subcommittee. Congressman Petri attended Goodrich High School in Fond du Lac and received undergraduate and law degrees from Harvard College. He served in Somalia as a Peace Corps volunteer and then in the White House focusing on anti-drug efforts. He is married to Ann Neal Petri, and they have one daughter, Alexandra. Congressman Petri will speak about income-based repayment legislation he's introduced, known as the Excel Act. And obviously, we also thank Congressman Petri for coming after a very busy last couple of weeks in D.C. So a special thank you for his presence. Also, there's on Skype, you'll see Kevin James, who is a legislative aide working for Representative Petri. He works on issues related to education, the workforce, and several other topics. He has a BS in computer science from Virginia Tech and an MA in economics from George Mason University. So Kevin James is joining us. Next, we have Tim St. Louis, has taken an interesting career route from investment banker to classroom teacher to college admissions officer. As a PhD candidate, Tim combines these experiences and conducts research into the personal finance habits of college students. With help from La Follette School's Professor Bob Haveman, Tim has researched alternatives to traditional loan system for the past 3 years and has recently formed his own nonprofit to pursue these ideas. Professor Jacob Gross is an assistant professor of higher education at the University of Louisville. His research focuses on financial aid, diversity policies, and student mobility. Dr. Gross teaches classes on administration, diversity, history of higher education, and resource management. Prior to teaching at the University of Louisville, he has worked as a policy analyst for the West Virginia Higher Education Policy Commission. Next is Professor Nicholas Hillman, who is an assistant professor of educational leadership and policy analysis at UW-Madison. He is also a Wiscape affiliate. Dr. Hillman studies higher education finance and financial aid policy. He also serves as the associate editor of the Journal of Student Financial Aid. He joined the ELPA faculty at UW-Madison this fall. Last, our moderator, Professor J. Michael Collins, is an associate professor at the La Follette School of Public Affairs and the School of Human Ecology. He's also faculty director of the Center for Financial Security at the UW-Madison. He studies consumer financial decision-making in the financial marketplace, including the role of public policy and influencing credit, savings, and investment choices. Please welcome our guests, and we will start hearing first with Congressman Tom Petri. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm happy it worked out. I was able to join you here for this important forum. As was mentioned, I've been a member of the Education and Workforce Committee, or used to be called the Education and Labor Committee in the House of Representatives for many years, and I think sometimes we get involved in one aspect or another of federal involvement in education and end up kind of not paying attention to what the basic underlying federal interest is, which is greater now than ever before, and that is to make sure that everyone in the country has an opportunity, regardless of family financial background, to have access to all of the education that they can profitably use. And that's more important today than it has ever been, as anyone, as I do, the district that, we don't think of this, we think of Wisconsin as cheeseheads and a beautiful place to have recreation and our more lakes in Minnesota and so on. We're actually number one, or some years number two, but among the top 2 of the 50 states in the percentage of people who work in manufacturing. And the district I represent is by far the number 1 district in the state of Wisconsin. 80,000 plus people get up every morning and go to work producing things in a factory setting. And the district was 6th of the 435 congressional districts in manufacturing, but is now just moved up to 4th of the 435 congressional districts. Just as an aside on that, which number 1, it turns out it's a district in California represented by Mike Honda, right outside of Silicon Valley. And I said, well, 150,000 people in manufacturing. Mike, how can that be? He said, well, they say all this stuff is done in China and Taiwan and so on, but it's not exactly true. They do a lot of manufacturing of key components and things that they're worrying about that as a proprietary or special thing, or insert them later in California when they get the thing back. So there's an awful lot of manufacturing related and is associated to all the high tech. But what's happened is, more than ever before, is a growing split. More and more people are looking for jobs, and more employers are looking for employees, but the skills that are required are not those that people have. And we have to increasingly work as a society to figure out strategies to close that gap, because the jobs that exist today aren't your father or your grandfather's job. They're increasingly jobs that involve managing processes that require some knowledge of obviously literacy and numeracy to be able to manage and keep control of processes and communicate online all around the world from a factory floor. These institutions have become very flat. They no longer have different levels of management. Really, the talk about quote-unquote associates and being part of a team is really increasingly the case. And so it's very important that the federal government maintains that commitment to access to higher education, and that it be as effective as possible. And it's in that connection that we've been working on what we call the Excel Act, or something that would help not only get access, but make sure that it ended up being manageable from a financial point of view for individuals. Some people say, well, why not just pay for it? Well, that was wonderful in a way, but you do run into the whole issue of moral hazard too, where if something's free, people will overuse it and take advantage of the situation. And if it's not managed cleverly or carefully, you'll lose public support for that expenditure. And it's not a wise thing in the long run to have a situation where people perceive they're being taken advantage of with a particular program. Let me just step back for a minute before going over a few details of the Excel Act to say where it came from. A long time ago now, when I was first a member of the Education and the Workforce Committee, a fellow named Jim Nelson, who at the time was the head of the Wisconsin Higher Education Aids Board, and it still exists, and it helps finance educational opportunity at the state level. Paid a courtesy call, and we started chatting, and I said, well, you know a lot more about all this than I do. What would you be doing with the student loan and grant programs and so on if you had my job? And he said, well, the truth of the matter is that I can say this now, but he said, if you quote me on this, I'll probably get fired. But the existing program is really kind of goofy. And then he went through to explain what he thought were anomalies and abuses in the program. And he said, if I were doing it, what I would do is to have an unsubsidized program. If you have an unsubsidized program, you don't have to have a means test. Everyone can take it. It's very simple. But if it's unsubsidized, people who are wealthy aren't going to take advantage of it because there's no particular benefit to it. And then I would have people repay the loans based on their after-school income, on an income contingent basis. People who are earning more would pay, his idea would pay a little more, people earning less would pay a little less, and so they would end up, people who are more fortunate would end up subsidized. So it's like a progressive income tax except within the student loan program. And I've actually been kind of working on that idea ever since. At the time we had that meeting, we had the federal guarantee student loan program. There was no direct student loan program. Over the years, we managed to, and the guarantee program, people say, well, it's a private program because private banks are making the loans. It's not a private program because the federal government is the one that's on the hook. It's guaranteeing the loans. And the program was heavily subsidized, but many of the subsidies were actually going to the banks, not to the student borrowers. Let me say this one other thing before going into the program. While we were working on the direct student loan program and trying to lay the groundwork for income contingent repayment, the UK decided they had to change the way they financed higher education in England. Historically, in the UK, it seems strange to Americans, but only about 5% of their students went on to university. When they got to be, I think, 14 or 15, they had an exam, and the really bright ones, the very top 2 or 3%, basically either were subsidized or got jobs at good universities. Very wealthy people would send their kids to Oxford or Cambridge or a few other places, and they didn't pay much attention about loans or other things to provide general access. When they decided they needed to move to more of an American system, that they decided that they had to come up with tuition to pay for it and then some sort of a student loan program. And they had the advantage of not having to fight existing institutions in a sense, because they were doing something brand new. And from the get-go, they put in an income contingent student loan repayment system. So it's not something, and this is what our program is modeled after. And when they were doing that, they came over and talked to myself and other people on the education committee in Washington. We had several meetings at the British Embassy with some of their experts who were looking at how they were doing. Now we're trying to return the favor by looking at with their experience. It's a little bit like using a state as a laboratory in democracy, which is part of the idea of a federal system. Except in this case, we have Australia, New Zealand, and the UK that all have direct student loan programs, and they've been working for a number of years very well. And unlike in our country, the student loan default rate is very small. The average student loan in the UK, I think, is about $14,000 or thereabout. In our country, it's about $15,000 or $16,000. But in our country, the default rate, you can measure it different ways. Some people say it's really quite high, almost a third. But I think I had some figures that it's at least 13-14% default rate in the United States. In the UK, it's under 3%. So it's a good deal for the taxpayer, and it's a good deal for the students in that when they default, it's not without consequences. You suddenly affects your credit score and your access to capital for a student for a auto loan or anything else. It's a new world out there in that regard. I was reading an article the other day which told me that one of the most important questions a young man asks a young woman or vice versa when they go out on a date is, what's your credit score? Because if they end up getting married, you could inherit a very bad credit rating, and it could be a big problem. Never would have occurred to me, but I guess that's the modern scene. Anyhow, let me just say a few things, and I'll stop, about the Excel Act, which has been introduced now. We've done it a couple of Congresses, but Kevin James has really been working very hard to refine it and get input, and we have it's been introduced on a bipartisan basis with one of my Democratic colleagues on the Education Committee from Colorado and myself, and we have interest in the Senate as well. And basically, what it does is, instead of a mortgage-like payment for a student loan, which is what we have now, where and for most house mortgages, you borrow $40,000, then you make fixed payments until you pay it off of the same. What we do is to say that you would pay a percentage of your income after school over 150, that you earn over 150% of the poverty level. So you're actually paying no interest on the first $15,000 that you earn a year. That's for your basic living. And then after that, under our proposal, this would be obviously subject to debate and discussion as it moves forward. We would have you paying 15% of your income. So people say, well, 15% sounds high, but it's really not. It's not 50% on your whole income. It's 15% on the amount over. So it's never 15%. It's always, depending, if your income is $17,000, it's really only 1% or something of your income. It goes up as your income goes up toward 15%, but it never reaches 15% because of the first part of your income that's not subject to it. All you have to do as a student, unlike some of the current programs that provide for consolidation and income contingent repayment, is to tell your employer that you have a student loan. You don't even have to tell them the amount. And they would then withhold from your paycheck when you earn over that amount, and send it into through the IRS to a agency associated with the Education Department that would manage this process. If you didn't tell your employer when income tax payment time came around, your Social Security number would be indicate that you had earned income, and you would be assessed an extra payment at that time. So it would make sense for you to do it on an income contingent basis rather than getting a big bill when tax time came in addition to your regular tax. That's how that's enforced. We do have several other things to help make this affordable, particularly for low-income earners. One, we don't provide for interest accruing on interest. So you don't have this sort of death spiral where the loan, if you're not paying, it's accruing, interest is added, but it's only on the principal. And then we cap the interest that can be added because of you're not paying at 50% of the capital of the loan. So there is a subsidy toward low-income borrowers. We don't provide for loan forgiveness, but we think that this subsidy will make it much more affordable for people if they're making even modest incomes to gradually repay the loan. And psychologically, and in terms of selling this program to the general public long term, people feeling that they've earned their education and they've paid it back means, I think, you can sustain public support for this access program at a much higher level than if people think it's some sort of boondoggle or freebie. That's the general outline of it. I think I'll be happy to do my best to try to answer a few of the questions despite my somewhat groggy state, having been listening to all kinds of emotional arguments about other things in the last couple of days. But if I don't know the answer, I think Kevin James, who's sitting in on this discussion, would be more than able to fill us in.
Well, I'd probably just like to start by thanking the federal government for reopening last night. It was really, really nice of them to do that just so the congressman could be here today. And I did not know that Wiscape brown bags carry that kind of weight, so it's nice. Yeah. So as you may recall from my introduction, I do have a background in finance, but it might surprise you that despite those experiences, I'm not here today to talk about money. And I'm not here to talk about money because I feel like the conversations that have been taking place since the Oregon plan popped up last summer have been sort of overwhelmingly focused on the economic factors that are endemic to some of these income-based plans. And what I like to do is maybe take my time and talk about some of the social and cultural elements that students have to deal with, and maybe try to shift the focus towards the lived experiences students while they're attending. And this is not to say that economic issues are unimportant. They're very important, and I'm hoping we can maybe cover those during the Q&A session at the end. But what I am trying to say is that failing to consider these kinds of factors in the same way that maybe traditional economics treats people as purely rational individuals is going to shortchange the policy initiatives that we put forth to try to improve these conditions. So with thanks to the congressman for covering some of these issues in a purely income-based repayment system, I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about pay-it-forward plans, similar to those offered by Oregon this last summer. So in short, I could say that income-based repayment provides a number of improvements to the traditional loan systems, but they still walk and talk and act like the traditional loan system while the student is in college. And by contrast, the pay-it-forward system retains these similar benefits during the alumni repayment phase that are offered by income-based repayment. But they also offer a lot of assistance to students and families while a student is attending. These improvements stem primarily from what I like to call financial grappling. And by this I mean the ways in which students make financial decisions. Traditional research in this area focuses on objective issues like financial literacy levels, but financial grappling, as I define it, incorporates both literacy issues as well as social and cultural norms that play a huge role in financial decision making. So in theory, it kind of breaks down like this. The traditional loan system and income-based repayment system, students are burdened with the need to make loan-related decisions. And by comparison, pay-it-forward designs alleviate this burden. It reduces the need to grapple with how many loans to accept or decline, how much to work or to study, how much to socially integrate with your campus versus how much you have to withdraw. Perhaps most importantly, financial grappling, like I just described, breaks down along income lines. Working class and lower income students do more of it. A growing body of research suggests that financial decisions are not made once a year when that aid offer letter comes in the mail, but for lower income and working class kids, these are decisions they make on a month-to-month or week-to-week or even day-to-day basis. Also, working class and lower income kids appear less equipped to to grapple with financial decisions. Another body of research suggests that their financial literacy levels are lower, that they are more loan averse and debt averse than their peers, and that they're less likely to receive assistance or observe optimal behaviors within their social networks. So that's kind of the theory of it. Let's maybe clarify things by walking through a hypothetical student experience in an income-based repayment system versus a pay-it-forward system. So under income-based repayment, a net price of $10,000 needs to be covered by some combination of loans and out-of-pocket payments. And we're all aware that a student's ability to make those out-of-pocket payments varies widely by their personal background factors. But what's less recognized is that their ability to deal with this $10,000 problem also depends on these background factors. It could be, for example, that taking out $6,000 or more in loans is the optimal decision, that the remaining $4,000 is manageable. A student can work and study and build social capital. But if a loan-averse student is only comfortable accepting $2,000 in loans, then that remaining $8,000 forces them to make personal and academic sacrifices. Working too many hours, for example, has a negative impact on a student's academic health. Failing to build deep friendships and build social capital has negative impacts on a student's emotional health. And not spending enough time studying, too many time doing other things and making these sacrifices has a negative impact on their academic health. By contrast, a pay-it-forward system operates differently. Under this $10,000 hypothetical, a plan similar to Oregon's, $4,000 of that 10 would be immediately covered by the system. And any Pell Grants or need-based loans can be redistributed to cover the other 6, which reduces what's left over for students to grapple with. Now, no system is perfect, and a student could still make a suboptimal decision about what's left to do with this leftover $2,000 or $3,000. And they may still experience some of these negative impacts that I talked about before, but I think we can all agree that the scale of negative impacts on a $2,000 or $3,000 mistake is far lower than it is on a $10,000 mistake. Plus, under a pay-it-forward system, the alumni repayment benefits endemic to an income-based system is still in place because pay-it-forward repayment amounts are proportional to income. So the bottom line for me consists of a series of sort of fine-grained qualifications. I believe that any form of income-based repayment is far superior to the traditional loan system. But I do believe that the Congressman's plan is the best among our available options, and it should be passed immediately. And I'm not just kissing up, I mean that sincerely. But while I do really like the Congressman's plan, I feel that Oregon's pay-it-forward plan is preferable. But while I do like Oregon's pay-it-forward plan, I do think some design changes could be made. And I could talk about them all day long, but I'm really just going to focus on one of my remaining few minutes here because I feel like it's critical to the long-term success of any pay-it-forward program. My suggestion is this: alter the cost coverage. Rather than provide partial coverage for all students, I would provide full cost coverage, but only for working class and lower income students. More specifically, any student who is eligible for at least $1 of Pell Grants would have the full net price of attendance covered by the system. This would completely eliminate any financial grappling issues that students may experience, and it would maximize their ability to improve their in-college experiences. The suggestion also, unfortunately, reduces the cohort of students that are covered by the plan. And it's unfortunate because only 15% of, for example, UW-Madison students are Pell eligible. But the advantage of having that small cohort, the other side of that coin, is that a smaller cohort would reduce startup costs, which is a huge part of the Oregon issue right now. You may have heard numbers like $9 billion. Again, that's for full students all statewide. A smaller cohort for Pell eligible students would really reduce that startup cost. Another advantage of smaller cohorts is that it's easier to manage. It would reduce the costs associated with logistics and collections which is thought to be one of the more intricate and difficult issues with the Oregon plan. Finally, perhaps to my mind most importantly, the targeted nature of a Pell-only system has the potential to build community and engender a sense of intergenerational support among working class and first-generation students. Rather than feeling that their payments go into some large, faceless pool of money, low-income students can feel some sense of ownership over their payments. In the long run, this would be a system funded by working class kids for working class kids. I've had the opportunity to conduct a number of focus groups with lower income high school students and lower income college students, and this kind of just like us benefit is something that really comes through and is consistently part of the feedback, unsolicited, as a huge benefit to a pay-it-forward model that I've just described. And I think engendering that kind of buy-in would really cut down on some of the gaming behaviors and some of the costs associated with these gaming behaviors. So I think to wrap things up, I'd like to be clear that pay-it-forward systems are not a silver bullet. There are certainly obstacles that they don't address and trends that they don't overcome. But I don't believe that a pay-it-forward exacerbates these conditions, and I don't really believe that a silver bullet exists. If the question is, do I support increasing the public investment in higher education, my answer is absolutely. But in the meantime, I do think that income-based repayment and pay-it-forward systems are effective ways to reduce the financial barriers without focusing solely on price.
Great. Thanks. Can you all hear me okay? Okay. So this is a topic that Jake and I and some of our other colleagues are really only scratching the surface on when it comes to the academic side of the house and research on student financial aid. But before I get into that sort of bigger picture and sort of seeing where this piece fits into the financial aid landscape, I wanted to quickly thank Wiscape for pulling that policy brief together for us in time, and also to recognize Taylor Weishman, who's been assisting on this project, a doc student in ELPA, and Matt Barry, one of Jake's students at Louisville, have been working on this project together. It's been a very fun project because it's new to us, and so I think that's a good place for me to begin this part of the discussion. The sort of miniature title or subtitle of our piece is a question. Is this an old solution that's looking for new problems, this income-based repayment model or the Oregon model or any other sort of flavor of what we call income-related repayments, alternatives to the mortgage-style payment of student loans. Now, with that context in mind, where we begin with our research is, well, with what we know. And when we look at student financial aid literature in general, it falls into pretty much one of two camps. We've got studies on the impacts of financial aid on college student choices. What's the role of an additional $100 in grants in a student's decision to enroll or persist in college? Those are the standard questions we ask in the aid literature. We also ask, what's the role of information in college choices? But beyond that, when we look at student financial aid from the academic perspective, we rarely, unfortunately, look at the tail end, on the repayment side, on how are students paying their debts back, what is the role of information in that process, and what are some alternatives to the current ways that we finance this loan system, and even bigger than that, what are the origins of the model that we currently have? Now, I can't answer that question, but I can speculate some alternatives. We didn't always have a loan model, right? We started offering loans, and folks in this room, looking at Susan especially, know this better than I do. But we didn't, there wasn't a rule that said we have to have student loans. This was a self-imposed decision on how we want to finance post-secondary education. This is a policy option. And once we decided that, once we jumped that hurdle, we decide, well, what kind of a loan system ought we have? Well, we've chosen the mortgage-like model. But even before we adopted any federal student loan policy, Milton Friedman was advocating for a model of financing post-secondary education according to one's future incomes. Human capital contracts, we sometimes have referred to them as. I think the new jargon is something like income share agreements. Income-based repayment is part of this sort of family of alternative repayment options. But the idea here, and we've just touched on the surface in our policy brief, the idea here is that the the roots of this policy solution that we currently have, this policy idea that we currently have, is tied directly to these market-oriented ideas of rational actors and a lot of Milton Friedman's original concepts of the purpose and the way of financing education. Now, the interesting part of this is that Republicans, Democrats, doesn't really matter the political persuasion, have in some form or another agreed with this general financing model. We've seen in 1993, President Clinton's administration started the nation's first sort of wide-scale income contingent loan program, which is essentially what Friedman was promoting back in the 50s. And we also then see in the 2000s, President Bush's administration starting the income-based repayment plan, and we see most recently President Obama with the pay-as-you-earn plan. So we have 3 existing programs that are designed to help students on the back end of student financial aid repaying their debts, that they have this origin in this philosophical idea of linking future earnings to incomes. Now, that's just for context, to think about this policy solution to the student loan problem. What we haven't done enough of is really dig into what the problem is. And I think that each one of us at the table and each one of us in this room could point at a different problem that these alternative repayment models are trying to solve. And the irony of this is that I think most of us would agree that these alternative income-based repayment models are designed to prevent students from defaulting on their debts. That's a pretty agreeable outcome that we say, okay, that's something that these models can not only achieve, but it's a problem that we want to resolve. But the idea back in the 50s, when Milton Friedman first promoted this type of financing, was far before the first federal student loan was even made. And it was far earlier than the first person could even default on that loan. So this has been a solution that's just been floating around in what Kingdon would call the primordial soup of public policy, or just an idea that's been floating around there. We're trying to catch it and apply it to a problem, is the way that I'm looking at this topic when I approach it with fresh eyes. Now, when we start to critique the underlying problems of student financial aid, and we ask this question, well, why in the world are students graduating with so much debt? Why are they defaulting, 1 in 3, or whichever number we want to point to, 1 in 10? Why are they defaulting on their loans? That's the problem. And while income-related repayments would probably resolve that problem, does it really resolve the source of the problem? Now, that's the question we need to, I think, also incorporate in these discussions. And I point to at least 3 sort of primary sources of the problems, just briefly, and then we'll segue into a discussion about what other questions ought we be asking, what else do we need to know in order to really guide our decision-making around alternative repayment plans. President Obama is proposing for all borrowers to participate in income-based repayment, pay-as-you-earn programs. Congressman Petrai's policy would be applicable to all borrowers. And so these are creative solutions, but do we have a good handle on whether it resolves the problem? Now, there are 3 things that are driving the student loan debt problem. One is state divestment in higher education results in higher tuition, and as a result, students are relying more on loans. And I don't see how this either encourages states to invest or mandates states to invest or change any behaviors of what's been happening. It actually might be an open door to saying, you're off the hook, states. Students will pay for it later. We got this. More of the privatization of higher education that we've been seeing. So that's one reason. The purchasing power of Pell Grants and other grant aid programs is also shrinking. Tim's example of having Pell cover a certain share of the Oregon students' financing might work this year, but that funding stream is volatile. It's politically contentious from at least my perspective. It's not a guarantee for low-income students, and other programs, state aid programs and institutional aid programs, are also not guarantees. So the purchasing power of these aid programs is declining. But by tying our future earnings to our incomes doesn't really address those issues. So these might still be on the table even if we had these expanded alternative repayment models. And the third one, this is an interesting one, and it's a contentious one as well, but when we start to ask, all right, well, who defaults on their loans? Let's try to understand this part of the problem a little bit better. Who defaults on their loans? Almost half of them are attending a certain sector of higher education, and that's the proprietary sector, the for-profit sector. Now, only about 10% of the students around the country enroll in this sector, yet they account for almost half of all the student loan defaults. So tying loans to incomes might work, but does that let the bad actors off the hook if we sort of give a get out of jail free card in a sense of saying, well, you don't have to worry about student loan defaults anymore, even though it's clearly currently a problem. And the amount of subsidies that's propping up the for-profit sector, federal taxpayer subsidies, sometimes 90% of an institution's revenue is coming from you and me, taxpayers. And these are getting shuffled into shareholders' hands via the student and the student aid program. So it doesn't really address any of those issues for the for-profit industry and how they might change and be more responsive and responsible to students. But anyways, those are three of the main state divestment, purchasing power of grant aid programs, and the proprietary sector's role in student loan default. These income-based repayment models don't really address those head on. They address default, absolutely. They do address default, but maybe the root problems are going to still be there. And so I would be concerned moving forward about really keeping a clear eye on those underlying problems, whether those are changing before we can measure the success of these income-related models. And so that's where our thinking is at on the research side of the house. Is let's try to get a handle on who's participating in these programs, and B, see if there's a nice connection between problems and solutions here.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you, everyone. I think somewhat selfishly, Nick and I are hoping to use this forum as a venue to workshop and develop some ideas about how to evaluate these different programs. And so what I'm going to do is just take a few minutes to zoom way out on this issue and think about how we understand and evaluate the different models, and so the different proposals and policies. And so I want to start with a question that is to everyone here who does not work in financial aid or who is not a U.S. congressman. How many existing repayment plans are there for student loans? Does anyone know the number?
Egyptian, she's an intern.
We have 4.
Seeing how American
Anyone want to take a guess? It's not 4, it's higher.
my office, and I was going to follow me around.
9? 9 existing repayment plans. Susan, is that right? 11. Okay, so I was even off there. So 11 different repayment plans. And how many of you, may I ask, and I'm not asking amounts here, how many of you have student loans currently? Yeah, a lot of us. And how many of you, so no one knew there were 11 repayment plans. How many of you have explored different options for repaying your loans? A few of us. Okay. So where I sort of want to enter this conversation is acknowledging the complexity of these different repayment plans. And in the policy brief we prepared, I mean, we really focused only on income-related repayment, but that is just a part of a number of existing policies. And then add to that, there are a lot of proposals floating around. And as sort of Nick and I have wrestled with this and talked with folks and actual financial aid practitioners and actual economists and finance folks and people who sort of work on this stuff day to day, it's really sort of complex to understand. And so what we've been trying to do is think through how can you compare not only existing policies, but also those that are being proposed. And so what I want to do sort of with this is introduce a potential framework related to distributive justice, right? Because at the end of the day, if you think about these questions, about these policies, it's a matter of who should pay for education and who benefits from education and getting an education, right? And so I want to, we sort of talk about these things at the abstract level, but for those of us that have loans, and all of us have received education, it's a question of how should policy relate to what you had to pay and how you've benefited from the education you received. And that's really what this is about at the end of the day. And so in some sense, this is kind of a philosophical and moral and ethical debate. And that's kind of where we want to enter this with sort of this broader picture. And to do that, we want to sort of think about a potential framework, and again, we're looking for feedback on this, of effectiveness, efficiency, and equity. Okay? So please jot those down because we are looking for feedback here. And there, I want to acknowledge here, so there are whole books out there on the concept of equity or the concept of efficiency and how it is defined. And to be sure, those are contested ideas, those are contested terms, and they are used differently by people with different sort of philosophical stances, different political ideologies, right? So that's all stuff to sort through on this. But I want to sort of briefly define how we're thinking about each of those three parts of this framework, and then kind of talk about the challenges with applying this framework and perhaps some of the advantages. And again, our task here is really, I mean, we have our sort of own positions, our own ideologies, our own points of entry. Nick and I do, and all of us in this room with this debate. But the question from a policy perspective, we think, is how do you compare, right? How do we talk about the United Kingdom or Australia in a way that is somewhat comparable to the United States when we're looking at these different programs and policies, because these are different contexts. So the notion of effectiveness, I'm going to start there. And just sort of briefly, this is, in some ways, perhaps the simplest to sort of think about is this idea of what are the proposed outcomes, right? So what does the policy say it's going to do, and what does it actually do? Did it actually achieve these? Right, so an example here is for income-based repayments. Did borrowers with financial hardship, so income-based repayment is means tested. It's 15%, if you're paying more than 50% of your income. Forgive me, it's hard for me to keep these things straight. If you're paying more than 15% of your discretionary income to pay your loans, that's considered financial hardship, and you're eligible income-based repayment. Financial aid experts in the room, please correct me if I get this wrong. So that the question would be, are people that qualify enrolling in the program? And that is one measure, that's one way to think about effectiveness. Now, I'll note here that a challenge is that we don't have the data on these things, right? So if a seemingly straightforward question, if you wanted to ask the Department of Ed, and if you want to be entertained someday, if you're familiar with or know Mark Kantrowitz, ask Mark Kantrowitz about his experiences trying to get data from the Department of Ed on this. To simply ask for the number of people who are eligible for this program, so we're actually taking advantage of the program over the denominator, right, is the number of people in repayment. The Department of Ed does not break out students who are still in school from those who have finished and are actually in repayment. So we don't have data on who's actually finished school in one sense or another and is actually repaying, right? So effectiveness, again, what did it say it was going to do, and did it actually achieve that? Seemingly simple, but somewhat hard to do in practice. Efficiency, right? So this is our second kind of concept that we're playing with here in terms of a framework. Efficiency can be sort of thought of as productive efficiency or technical efficiency and economic efficiency. Okay, so the productive efficiency is probably what we hear most about or most familiar with, but it's this idea of, and for all of us who are educators in the room, this should be familiar to us, doing more with less, right? It's what we're asked to do every day, right? So we have the same number of inputs coming in, but we're supposed to increase our outputs. So productive efficiency is about the ratio of inputs and outputs. So from this perspective, we would want to be asking questions about program costs, right? So programs that automatically enroll students via their employers ostensibly have kind of a lower cost than having to work through the Department of Ed and then the IRS potentially, right? So that's productive efficiency. Economic efficiency is somewhat similar, but it compares one policy A to policy B, compares the costs and benefits. And overall there, what you're sort of looking at is, of the two competing proposals, which has the most sort of favorable ratio of cost to benefits. So that's one way of sort of defining economic efficiency. So finally, equity, and we, I mean, in part because of our own biases and stances, we think this is a particularly important concept here, and particularly the notion of horizontal equity and then vertical equity. There's a third that I'll touch on briefly, but it is hard to apply in this sense, which is outcome equity. So horizontal equity, in brief, is really sort of this idea of that individuals with equal needs get equal resources. So from the congressman's proposal, the example there would be that everyone who has a loan is automatically enrolled, right? Equal needs, you're sort of equally enrolled. Vertical equity is this notion of people with different needs get different resources. Now, from our perspective, in the US context, that is important because there is lots of evidence and lots of research. We know that access to education is not equal for all people, right? And so again, going to the congressman's proposal, the notion of vertical equity there is encompassed in this idea of there being a means test in it, right? So lower income folks are repaying different portions of their loans, or their interest is being capitalized in a different way. Now, outcome equity is sort of the last notion here that I'm going to talk about with this, and then I'm going to kind of try and summarize strengths and weaknesses. Outcome equity is interesting for those of you that are sort of policy folks. It's this notion of policy backcasting. So you say we want to end up with, 5% default rate, and then you talk about the resources that you need to get there. Now, if you think about it, that's probably a particularly challenging thing to do because we don't exactly know. We have some ideas about why people default, for example, but we don't necessarily know how we should spend our money or what resources we need to invest to reduce default. That's just one example. And then think about this, how would you get policymakers, how would you get Congress to agree on what an acceptable outcome is? So this notion of sort of outcomes equity is a bit more challenging. Right, so to summarize, we're talking about effectiveness here, efficiency, and equity. Those are that's sort of the three concepts that we want to sort of think about in terms of being able to sort of compare and contrast these different proposals. Now, problems in doing that, right, to sort of anticipate questions that would be raised about sort of doing some of this, is that we still have the limitation of data. So to some extent, we would still want to collect some data to be able to understand effectiveness, efficiency, or equity, and that could be challenging. It could be cost prohibitive. So as one example of this, a cost of enrolling in public service loan forgiveness. Nick's heard me complain about this incessantly lately. I've been a public servant now for 7 years with my time in state government and as a professor at a public institution. I have talked to at least 3 different longtime financial aid professionals about how I can or can't enroll in the program. It's not clear to me whether I'm eligible. It seems like I have to go through a process of applying to the program. It's means tested to some extent. And so I'm sitting here thinking, I've got 2 young kids. I'm trying to learn what it means to be a professor, trying to publish, trying to teach. The opportunity cost right now of me going through and doing all that is pretty high. And so when I say we can't collect some data or the data collection may be cost prohibitive, that's kind of what I'm talking about, is that for each of us there is an opportunity cost, for example, of enrolling in these programs, right? And to collect that data is probably impossible. And that makes it a challenge for us to truly sort of evaluate these, use this framework. The other sort of, beginning to wrap up, or this other sort of challenges are that drawing causal linkages between a program and an observed effect are difficult, right? So if we implement an income-based repayment program and we see our default rates drop, how do we necessarily know that is the result of this program that was implemented? So as we're coming out of the recession, for example, I would expect we would begin to see our default rates drop. To wrap up, though, I think some of the benefits of this work, and I've talked about some of this, about potentially fleshing out and using this framework. One is that it begins to sort of systematize and develop a common language for comparing what are often very different policies and proposals, right? And we think that's important because in many ways here we're talking about apples and oranges. Perhaps most importantly, from my perspective, because I get excited about data, is that even if we can't collect all the data we think we need, it would certainly be interesting to think about what data we could collect to begin to evaluate some of these programs and suggesting to our policymakers that in legislation we build in some feedback loops, right? So if we need data on who's enrolling disaggregated by race, ethnicity, gender, and first generation status, we think about how we can collect that so we can be intentional on the back end of evaluating these programs, feeding that information back into the policy process, and then changing the policy if needed. And then finally, sort of the thing I want to wrap up with here is that sort of zooming way out, we think it's, financial aid is a field that is, and the debates around financial aid is often, I think, a field that is dominated by econometrics, economists, and is very sort of ends focused. And I sort of want us to revisit this idea that really at the end of the day, who pays for and who benefits from education is a moral sort of decision. It is a philosophical decision that we make as a society. And so to some extent, recognizing that in this framework we think is important in considering the different policies and proposals. Looking forward to some feedback on that and hopefully some critiques. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank all the panelists, and they asked me to moderate this. They said, you're going to be moderating a panel. We need to be timely. We need some discussion with the audience. Oh, and by the way, you're going to have an elected official on the panel. And I thought, well, that's not so bad. And they said, then you're going to have some academics. And I thought, oh, we're in big trouble. Academics are used to talk. We start talking, and we go for an hour and 15 minutes until the bell rings. So, but thanks all of you for staying on time and having some time for discussion. So I'm going to start off with a question for the panel, but I want you all to think of some questions as well for our panelists. We have a couple of at least one microphone, so we can get your thoughts of these panelists and questions that you might have as well. As a perspective of somebody who studies the credit markets and kept up with the newspapers lately, it seems like there's two debates right now. One is that students are defaulting, not students, but adults who have student loans are defaulting on loans, and that's a problem. The other is that students are accruing a lot of debt and they're entering their adult lives with high levels of student debt. So there's two issues going on. We hear the debate about both. One is that students have a lot of debt, and the other one is that they're sometimes not paying that debt. For each of the proposals and ideas that you've talked about, what is the core problem? Is it having a lot of debt relative to income, or is it the inability to make those payments in a timely way? Or is not making those payments actually okay, because maybe it doesn't make sense for them to be paying this debt? So how do we think about these two problems that are going on? So I open up to the panel.
I guess you're welcome. It's our guest. You're welcome.
Should I
to hop in,
Go ahead.
But I've got something also. So.
Well, I mean, isn't it a problem if people graduate and get a job and their options are severely restricted because they have large fixed payments to make, and if they don't make those payments, their options are even further restricted because their access to capital is cut back. So I think you're getting in danger of creating a kind of a sort of an indentured situation, which isn't all, I mean, Benjamin Franklin was an indentured servant. It's not all bad. You can acquire skills and become a multimillionaire as he did in his time. But for most people, I just think I'm trying to do is to look for ways to keep public support for financing access, and make it easier for people after they get out to preserve as many options as possible. And that's by making by just automatically tailoring your repayment to your individual circumstances rather than one-size-fits-all payments.
Yeah. I like a visual, and you did it with this. And what's missing is a bridge between the two. Just because there's a lot of student loan debt doesn't mean that's why a student defaults. In fact, the individuals who default on their loan, their average debt is something like $14,000 or so, whereas a student who, on average, I think graduates is like $26,000 in debt or something like that. So it's not necessarily the volume of debt that one carries that is associated with their default or delinquency on their loan. The thing I think that probably matters the most is whether or not that individual had a job and has steady income, whether they can navigate the 11 or however many by the end of this talk, maybe there will be 12 or 13 new repayment plans, how they navigate the repayment options, but also whether they earn a degree. So a lot of the students who default don't earn a degree, can't find a job, yet, like I mentioned earlier, the lion's share of the default is coming from these colleges that are promoting vocational education and they're represented by career colleges. And they're saying, you come to us, we'll get you a job, and you're going to make a lot of money. And they're not delivering on their promise. So I think the problem is not just poor, but in fact, maybe even intentionally delinquent consumer protection in this for-profit industry. And that, if we knock that out, we figure that out, we can save billions of dollars every year and probably refocus our energy on better solutions or new solutions to these aid problems.
Yeah, if I could just double down on that as well, it's also just to remind of the sort of cultural and social elements that I was talking about in my piece. It isn't just the amount of debt that one has, and it's not even just the amount of debt plus what kind of job you have, that there are elements around it, how comfortable you are with debt. I mean, these things have a lot of life impacts. Also, not only navigating the financial aid process and the 11 problems, but navigating the financial realities of life and how you pay for an apartment and buy beer or whatever you might be into. These things extend beyond the parameters of just financial aid and navigating financial aid processes. They're life management processes, and those vary widely by people's characteristics. So it's maybe even worse than Nick said, so sorry about that.
I'm an optimist.
Yeah.
Oh, do we have audio?
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
I just wanted to chime in. I think we shouldn't make the mistake of trying to use one policy instrument to solve all problems. There's actually multiple areas or problems, sort of market failures in higher education, and we have different policy tools to solve those. So to the original question of, is the problem the repayment side of things, or is the problem the amount of debt that people have? I think it's both. I think one of the things that Milton Friedman pointed out was that higher education is very risky in the sense that there's a lot of variation around the mean in terms of outcomes. And so part of, or when projects are financed in capital markets that are risky, typically use something that looks more like an equity, where you're returning a share of the profits to the investor instead of doing a traditional loan, which takes some of the risk off of the person borrowing the money and shares it with the investor. And so I think in higher education, one of the things Milton Friedman said was that part of the market failure was that traditional loans force students to bear too much downside risk, both in the form of liquidity risk, which is whether you have enough money to pay your obligation at any given time, or income risk, whether your investment never pays off and you really can't pay the thing off in your entire life based on your income. And his original idea was human capital contracts or graduate taxes or one of those, and it sort of evolved into income contingent loans. So to your point, Nick, I think income contingent loans are not really intended to address the level of student debt. They're intended to protect students from the downside risks that are inherent in investing in higher education. They're a superior tool than a traditional loan. And there are other mechanisms that, whether it be increased public subsidy and also better measures through disclosure and other things, to channel students towards more efficient and effective universities that can help to deal with the value side of things and how much debt people are taking on. And human capital contracts can theoretically play a role in that too. But so I just would separate the world into the multiple different problems we're trying to solve.
Question in the audience.
My question is primarily for... Oh, can you use the mic so that Kevin in Washington can hear us? My question is primarily for Representative Petri and Professor Gross as it relates to your comments on equity. But first, I'd like to say to Mr. St. Louis, thank you for addressing this notion of financial grapplers, because that was my story all throughout my undergraduate degree. And I gave up a lot of social capital to finally finish my bachelor's degree. So it's nice that I can finally put a label on myself.
It's trademark, so if you're going to use it, you pay it.
So for Congressman Petri, first, thank you for your long and distinguished service. It's clear that you and your staff put a fair amount of energy into the Excel Act proposal. I downloaded it from your website and read through it, and there's a lot of really interesting stuff there. As an aside, I have to say, though, I'm really disappointed in your no vote last night. No one should ever put the full faith and credit of the United States at risk. That is absolutely inexcusable. My question relates to the Excel Act language that addressed the ability, if it passes, to do away with forgiveness. And I can understand that by capping interest and putting it at a reasonable rate, that 20 to 25-year forgiveness maybe can go away. But would you extend that to other forgiveness programs like public service, like forgiveness for targeted occupations that are supporting underserved populations? Would you do away with all forgiveness under the Excel Act?
No, we do get rid of several subsidized in the existing program. One is the in-school interest subsidy, which was designed to encourage people, but no one even knows about it really very much. And the other is the 10-year loan forgiveness in the case of people who work for nonprofit or government entities. Because what we substitute, it's not as though the idea of capping, not having interest accruing on interest, and capping the amount of interest at half of the student loan. So and of course, any of the people who already have loans would continue to be eligible for the 10-year forgiveness. We can't go backward, but we're saying if you were starting fresh, would you give a $200,000 loan forgiveness to someone who has a PhD program and is working for a committee in Congress, as opposed to capping interest for people who are low income and avoid them getting into a downward spiral where they can never forgive their loans? And when we're making, if you're trying to make choices between how you're going to allocate subsidies, we think it's more rational to cap give the subsidy to people who, based on their earnings after school, are struggling. I mean, we're not speculating, and that's the choice we made. There are a lot of other specialized loan forgiveness programs for people teaching in rural areas, and 101 we don't touch any of those. It's just this one large, which I think it affects about could be as many as a third of the loans, and it may be hard to apply, as someone said, but if people figure it out. And it used to be, as I understand it, I thought, well, it's not as bad as it sounds or good as it sounds, because you'll get, if you have one of these huge graduate student loan situations and it's forgiven, then the IRS comes around and counts that as income. So then they'll tax you on the $200,000. But they've managed to get rid of that too. So it's not subject to, you don't pay taxes on that gift in effect, as people would if you get a lottery or get other gifts. So we just think if you're going to give a subsidy, it's more rational to do it based on, to give it to people who are who have demonstrated need based on having low after-school incomes.
Answer. One thing I would say is that we do preserve many of the federal government's forgiveness programs that go to specific targeted professions like National Health Service Corps and others. We don't touch any of those. One of our biggest concerns with the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program created in 2007 was that it is unlimited in the amount of forgiveness it provides. It is extremely broad in the scope. As Congressman Petri said, it's roughly 25% of the workforce. And we allow graduate students in particular to borrow extremely large amounts of money because we have no loan limits for graduate students. And so in some sense, we felt like that program was of an order of magnitude difference from the others, and that ultimately it could end up being a very large taxpayer liability and could be perceived as widely unfair to the other 75% who were not getting such generous forgiveness.
Is that why it's so difficult to know how to participate? Is this sort of by design in a sense where the feds actually don't want to promote this program too much? Is there a sense of that being the case? Yeah, I mean, seriously.
I get the sense that there's some people who do know about it because we're getting a lot of pushback from congressional staffers.
Might just be me.
I just think they've done not the best job of. I mean, they're doing a lot to promote it now. I mean, CFPB just put out a big report, and they're going to proactively outreach to people. So I just think the Department of Ed has been behind the curve in terms of their efforts to promote it.
I have a question. I'm an IBR participant, have been for a while, and I don't understand very much about it. In fact, that's one of the reasons I'm here. I do have a question about solving the problem. When I look back at myself, the person who took out that loan, I'm much different than I was then. How is it that I was able to take out a loan of a pretty substantial size? I mean, the size of a small house. I mean, it's basically unsecured. I feel, while I wanted it, probably wasn't the best thing for me, and looking back. But how does that work? What's the regulatory apparatus around that?
I mean, gosh, I can tell part of the story. Could I ask a question? Are those all federal loans? Okay, for undergraduate?
Well, through Sally Mae. These are loans through Sally Mae, so they were, federal loans, subsidized and unsubsidized.
So federal loans have caps on them and limits. Certain different types of loans have different limits on them, and those limits haven't really changed a lot over time, although there sometimes is the impression that the loan limits keep rising. So certain loans are capped at a certain level, depending on how far along in school you are. But there are so many other possible loans that students can take out that are not necessarily in that federal subsidized or unsubsidized program. Private loans or even parent loans and different kinds of plus loans out there for undergraduates and graduate students. So by the time you cobble together several different loans from several different sources, the limits on those loans can, rise significantly to be the size of a small house, like you said. One really important point to this is that most students borrow actually pretty small amounts of debt considerably. In contrast to what we see in the New York Times, the journalists will always find that student who has $100,000 in debt, and that's the exception to the rule. And not to discount that those stories, they matter a lot, and that's the question we need to be asking: how did they get so much debt? But on average, students aren't borrowing that much. And more often than not, they're borrowing between $10,000 and $20,000. Not that answers your question, but that does put some perspective around it.
I'm also not going to answer your question, but I think it does, though, add a layer to the discussion that we're having today, and that is that a lot of these issues are sort of statutory mandates that are placed on schools. I was talking to the financial aid director of a two-year institution, and maybe Stu can back this up as well, but they're not allowed to use their professional discretion to make choices about optimal packages for students. If a student asks for blank, you have to give them blank. And that may not be what's best for the student, it may not be what's best for the school, and it may not be what's best for the rest of us when that person's in repayment. But to whatever extent it's that top-down mandate, there are going to be a lot of nasty situations like this. But I'm glad that you're poking your head out of it a little bit.
This is something that people have been struggling with because, for example, the Department of Education is trying, and there are abuses in the student loan program to try to put tighter guidelines on proprietary schools or other schools with higher default rates. And when you and of course, there are some that are trying to do a very good job, and there are others that probably are trying to take advantage of the system. But you talk, you talk to some of them that claim they're trying to do a good job, they say, well, under the rules, we're required to make these loans if it's for their tuition or an education-related expense, which can mean a car or other things, and that there are a certain number of kids who come in and who want a car, not an education. But the way they can get the car is go in and sign up for a loan. They don't even show up for classes, and then they've gone off, and the school says, we can't deny it to them. And can you please change the rules, because then we get the bad reputation, but it's not really something that it's not our abuse. Someone is abusing the system, but we're the ones that are being blamed. So I hate to say it, but anything that you set up, almost, unless you really give a lot of thought to it, and even then, as it is out there, someone's going to figure out a way of breaking the system, and then the issue is how you refine it rather than throwing the whole thing out. And then, I mean, usually these programs exist for a very good reason, to give people access to education so they can improve themselves. If you required equity, as you were saying, or some sort of, as you would for buying a house or some other, then you deny an awful lot of people who don't have any means the opportunity of investing in them. You know, the community is trying to give people opportunities, like the public libraries in a certain sense, or other public schools, access to programs that will improve your skills and your self, you know, your awareness as a human being, which should benefit the whole society on average.
And just as somebody who's studied the mortgage market, the collateralization of the underlying asset doesn't actually make a huge difference in terms of some of the issues we've looked at in the last 4 or 5 years. So, you know, it's at the end of the year, at the end of the day, debt is debt, and collections is collections. So.
But I think if I can jump in, I think on that point, to answer your question as directly as I can, I think I would really sort of look to your financial aid professionals at your institution, because I think, you know, why someone takes out as much as they may take out really can vary. So in some cases, it may truly just be a bad, and I'm not saying this is you by any means, but this could just be a sort of a bad choice. That if you think about, as I'm fond of saying, you know, 18-year-olds' brains aren't done developing, right? And so they may not be fully able to make decisions like that. But in some cases, I mean, this car example I think is an interesting one, and it's an interesting kind of, it may happen, it may not, we don't know, we don't have much evidence on it, but I think of some work I was doing with community colleges up in the Chicagoland region, particularly around Gary, right? And so Gary, if you're familiar with the area, has really sort of been hit hard by the pullout and the decline of the steel industry in the United States. And we were talking to folks at the institution about students and their use of financial aid, and they sort of have administrators there saying, well, students are taking out these loans, and you know, they go out and they spend it on clothes and housing and cars and all that. And while that may not have been a good choice, it was interesting to note that within the past few years up in Gary, the public bus system had shut down because it couldn't be funded by the city or the state anymore. And so you have, in some cases, students taking out loans to replace the social welfare net, right? And so literally, they shut the bus system down, and to get to school, people had to use their student loans to pay for cars. Now, is that a good choice? I don't know, but I think that's a consequence of other things going on. And in that case, I'm not smart enough to think of a policy to address that, other than you leave it to the hands of your financial aid professionals and trust in that profession. That would be my answer.
I'll sort of take a shot at that and also ask a couple of questions. I'm Susan Fisher. I'm the Director of Financial Aid here. So we'll, just to be on record, you in theory cannot use your federal aid to buy a car. It's a no-no. But what's true is we can lend up to the cost of attendance, which every financial aid office on each campus will define as room, board, tuition, books. It's an average of averages, modest but adequate budget. So if you have a student that fits that criteria, all their aid may not exceed that, but if you want to borrow that, we are obligated indeed to let you. Up to the maximum of the federal loan, which in our school, even for in-state, we max out pretty quick. We have enough students who come in with private loans and want them all. And so I can give you an example, and just to say, we recently just got our default numbers. We are at 1% on this campus for federal loans, 1%. 1.1% for Perkins loans, and that is a 99% repayment rate, which I think is darn good. So our students do a great job of repaying, and I think that's fabulous. That said, we are starting to get numbers now on graduating debt load, and it's going to be probably about 26,000 is what I'm seeing, 26, 27, which is okay. It's not great. I'd like to see it lower. But we have a few up there in the $140,000 for an undergraduate, $99,000 of private loan borrowing with a high expected family contribution. So what you probably have there is a family using the student loan as a cash tool for a variety of things, not just the students. And again, we are obligated to permit it if the bank and lending institution says, give this person the loan. And so are we happy about it? No. Can we say no? We can't. We can just go, So I think these families, some of them are funding their entire 4 or 5 years all on loan when they didn't qualify for any regular grant-based, need-based aid. Does that make some sense? So there's that going on. The question I'd have, and Tim, for you in particular, with the Oregon plan, which is intriguing. We've talked about this for a couple of years, and I'm still having a hard time seeing how that would work. At Madison, for an in-state student, it's about $22,000 for 9 months for room, board, tuition, books, pizza, occasional beer. Certainly not a car. And less than half of that is tuition and a little, put books, so we're a little over half is tuition and books. The rest is cost of living. And our chancellor's made a couple of comments recently, which I appreciated, which she says, 30 years ago, as a nation, as a culture, we saved for our education, we saved for our houses, we saved for our cars, and now we borrow for all of those things. We put our vacations on a credit card, we max ourselves out completely with our homes, and we borrow everything we can for the cars, and we do the same for school. We've lost the ethic of saving as a family for something we want, that delayed gratification. So for the Oregon plan, how does it work? Is it just going to pay it forward with tuition or tuition and books, or the whole cost of attendance? Because if over half of your cost is choice making in how you live, and things like that, and is it only for Oregon residents? What about non-residents? How does that work?
Yeah, so the pilot program is still sort of being formulated. I think they have some suggested outlines, but the legislation itself is to develop a more detailed pilot plan by 2015. But I think suggested development they have is that it would cover tuition and fees only. And so which is about 45%, I think, in the state of Oregon. And so the other 55% is, as you said, up to personal discretion, and it still goes back to grappling then with the traditional loan system. So I think, for my money, as I said, I would prefer a full coverage plan. But again, I think it's important to remember the counterfactual that if someone is grappling with the 55% under this pay it forward plan, they would be grappling with 100% without it. So to whatever extent we can sort of alleviate that burden, I'm a fan of it. And I think this is where financial education comes in. I work for Michael, I should say, at the Center for Financial Security, and I think that improving the educational outlets that students are exposed to and helping them manage these decisions, if it's 100% or 55%, is a vital piece of the puzzle.
Maybe one comment on that. I think people have been struggling to figure out some way of substituting for tuition a percentage of your after-school income for a long time. Yale had a program before the federal programs got in, and so I think it's laudable that Oregon is trying to figure out how to do it. One of the issues that I would suspect would have to be dealt with would be the issue of which is true in health insurance and in many other kinds of programs like this of adverse selection. That is, someone who is pretty sure they're not going to have much income would happily sign up to a 4% thing. Someone who's pretty sure that they're going to have a lot of income because of the income that other people in the profession that they're going into have had would avoid that and would do loans or other things rather than committing 4% of their, I mean, people are pretty rational, and they'll figure that, and it, you know, it won't be 100%, but it will be enough that the program would go into one of these death spirals where it turns into a subsidy rather than a self-funding experiment.
Sure. I think if I could give a little pushback on the adverse selection issue, I mean, I do think it's a concern, and it's a legitimate concern. I have no doubt that there are some students who would go to a private institution rather than a public institution because of the costs associated. But the types of students who would do so is, to my mind, a pretty small group. You would have to have a student who, at the age of 17, knows exactly what they want to major in. And then you'd also have to have, know that they would, which is a pretty small group, they would want to major in a STEM field, which is another pretty small group. And they would have to ignore the other considerations in their enrollment decisions, which is a very small group. A lot of kids make their decisions on where to go to school because they want to go to football games, or they want to go where their best friend is going, or they want to run away from their high school best friend, or whatever. So there are a number of other considerations, I think, that reduces this adverse selection problem. And plus, the real kicker is that even if you have a rational student who believes themselves to be the kind of kid who's going to graduate and make a lot of money, the math just doesn't work out on the back end because private institutions are so prohibitively expensive. When the Oregon plan was announced, and over the summer I did some kind of back of the envelope math, and haven't been able to confirm it in the last 16 days because NCES is down, but if I recall correctly, a student would have to average about $120,000 a year in their post-attendance income to equate a public school cost with a private school cost. And that puts somebody in the top 5, 6, 7% of the income distribution. And that certainly could happen, particularly for electrical engineers, for example. But there are a lot of electrical engineers who don't make $120,000 a year. And so if someone is indeed irrational at the end of this process, they could still choose to go to the public school because the math just doesn't work out that way. So it's an issue, certainly, but I don't know how huge of one.
I think one of you talked about this a little bit. I was wondering if you could comment on the challenges of having both state and federal funding of higher education in general, and the incentives that occur because of that. In other words, if the federal government makes it more affordable for students to attend college by, making payment easier, you provide incentives for the state to take dollars out of state resources and put it onto the backs of students. If you could comment on that.
I briefly can. I know Jake's got some ideas too on this, I'm sure. There's not really a nice sort of theory of intergovernmental relations when it comes to student financial aid. It's pretty much, you got the feds doing their thing that targets needy students, financially needy students. You got 50 states running in all their different directions, and you've got thousands of institutions doing whatever they want to do with their aid. And I have yet to see or hear about a program that tries to, or an effort, not even necessarily a program, an effort to try to systematically combine these multiple silos in a strategic way that is aimed at really solving one of these social problems. And to Kevin's point earlier about, we can't expect one policy to solve it all, one ring that rules them all, right? That it's a joint effort, and this is a collective effort. So what we end up having is institutions, for example, spending a whole bunch of money, financial aid dollars, enticing students who are going to go to college somewhere anyways. They're spending billions of dollars on non-need-based aid, while the feds are trying to target their aid towards need-based aid. So you have these just just different sort of directions that are priorities that these different layers of government are interested in addressing. And I don't see where that common ground is. States could easily tie their aid to all Pell Grant recipients. Some state aid programs do. Is this kind of what you're getting at, wondering about?
We saw, for example, a couple of years ago when Pell increased, the state ended up saying, well, since that increased, we don't have to increase our
Sure.
state financial aid.
Sure.
In the same way, just by being more dollars out there for loans or Pell or whatever, there's weird incentives for the state to then say, well, I guess it's a little more affordable now, we can take state dollars out and raise tuition.
Yeah, I think that's the problem. There is no coordination. There is no incentive structure, and it's for good reason, because institutions are competing for students and competing for prestige and revenue and whatnot, and so for whatever reason they aren't trying to help those who have financial need. I mean, it makes sense from that perspective. It's this tension of wanting to do good and then sort of the market pressure of staying alive and staying fiscally solvent.
Let me just make one comment, and then we have hearings on this all the time, and people are very, they make the accusation, and it may be somewhat true, but less true than it looks on the surface, in my opinion. They say, well, if you have these aid programs or grant programs, all you're going to do is raise the cost of education, and therefore it's going to be less affordable for the middle class that doesn't qualify for some of these grants and other things, and so you're going to create access problems. And I think it is true that it used to be, certainly in my own personal experience, years ago, you could go to a college and the tuition for a year, you could earn a good percentage of it with a normal summer job. And now if it's, well, it was $4,000 a year at Harvard, including room and board. And I could earn $1,000 or $2,000 a year working at the Fond du Lac Bank. That's the truth. And so now it's $50,000, $60,000 a year. But it hasn't, what they do, the schools have done is set a high rate, but there's a lot of, it's not the average rate. They're working on maximizing their yield. And so they'll say $60,000, but there are very few students who pay $60,000 or parents. The higher income people who don't qualify for many grants, they're paying full freight. And then you have a lot of people who are getting loans from the school and various discounts and other sort of help. So that the yield, but what's going to happen in the next couple of years is that, I think, is that system is probably going to be breaking down for most schools. Madison is working on a lot of courses where people can take online and other ways of getting credentials that will be a lot less expensive than the traditional way the traditional 12-year, now 6-year, in many cases, colleges have evolved, because they're pricing themselves out of, and the side effect of is what we're wrestling with these huge loan problems. And what we're trying to do with income contingent is to alleviate that somewhat. But the underlying problem of higher and higher debt obligations is going to have to be dealt with by figuring out more economical ways of acquiring knowledge, and they do exist increasingly for most people. Sad to say.
Hello. I'm just wondering, when I hear you talk about IBR, income-based repayment, it makes me think of wages and AGI, adjusted gross income, as ways to determine that income. Currently, there are tax credits and adjustments for loans as far as interest. Have you thought about that, or what would your plans include about that type of funding?
We're trying to do an inventory of these income-related repayment models in the U.S. and abroad. And to my knowledge, I've not seen examples of, I have not been thinking about it in this way, examples of tax credits in lieu of sort of more wage-oriented subsidies. But you're not talking about like the existing tax credits, are you?
Yeah, the
Like
existing
the
ones, and then also the loan interest that you can claim on your tax return.
Oh, got it.
Reduced down your adjusted gross
Got it,
income. So different ways of playing with your income, your adjusted gross income.
Well, I'm out of my wheelhouse with this one, but Noel sent me an email this morning about something he saw in the paper on a state legislator who maybe is proposing something like this. And believe it might be a state tax credit for people who are repaying their loans. I'm not quite sure of the proposal, but you might see in the laboratory of ideas, right? You might see states trying to do this.
I would, so I would have two questions about, so in one sense, sure they would help, right? I mean, it'd be great to reduce our adjusted gross income, and then we're sort of on the hook for less. And, but I would sort of, my concerns about those proposals would be around vertical equity issues, right? And who takes advantage of those, and who knows how to take advantage of those. You know, for relatively well-educated middle-income folks, we become adept during our lives at knowing how to take deductions and work the tax codes. And for the wealthiest people, they hire very smart people to do that for them. And I think that becomes a real vertical equity issue. And this is not my argument, but I would question whether tax codes are the best mechanisms to address some of these problems that aren't really about taxes. That, you know, the notion of vertical equity, I'm looking at actual finance people. I think the notion of vertical equity is inherently built into our tax system. But I would, in terms of who takes advantage of those for loans and repayment of loans, I'd have concerns.
And that may be a whole other panel. We probably only have time for one more question. We have about four minutes left, so I don't know if we have one more question in the audience or if we.
We have a de facto loan bank, national loan bank, by all the repayments through all these different programs. And I wonder if that money could be used, you know, reorganized. I mean, I've watched this for a long, long time, and I went to school here, you know, and tuition was almost free until this middle 60s. And the private colleges only charged about twice as much as the publics, and that was pretty low too. And then we went and adopted the system we have, and we spend more than any other country in the world. Our tuitions are higher than any other country in the world. Our numbers, the other countries are catching up and passing us in some respects. You know, I wonder if we ought to rethink how we're allocating all this. And I wonder with this loan bank, I'm thinking about it, it really is a loan bank, but we don't call it that. You know, could you, way before Milton Friedman, you know, the idea, we had this low tuition system, and it was justified on the basis of, you know, people who graduate will earn higher incomes, and they will repay the cost, you know, of providing the education. And it sounds like, you know, the Oregon plan sort of comes almost back in that direction, you know, well, you know, you can, I mean, it's something you could use a loan bank for, you know. But anyhow, are we in a different context now because of the way it's evolved up to this point? And do we have to rethink what we're doing because of that?
I'll just jump in briefly thinking about kind of the history of higher ed, and I think for me, it's, I mean, part of this conversation is the cost conversation at the institutional level, which I think we've sort of nibbled around the edges at, but as part of that, you know, higher ed and is so diverse in this country, and as you well know, and is so different now than it was in the 1950s and 60s, that I'm not sure that we can go back to that sort of notion, because we are educating so many more people. Now, the proportion may be the same, but we are educating so many more people, and our institutions, for better and for ill, are doing much more than they used to do, which I think is part of the cost equation. And I think there's just generally less willingness on the part of the public writ large to invest in what we do and to invest in education at all levels.
I think a good example of that is the Yale program that people want to reference in regards to this Oregon program. To my mind, the Yale program had a very different design. It occurred a very long time ago, and those kinds of students are very different kinds of students than today's sort of public college type kids. So maybe there are some suggestions for how this might play out in the Yale program, but I would be skeptical of anyone who wants to shoehorn lessons from the Yale issue into today's context. And I think that gets back to things are very, very different, and we shouldn't maybe treat them like we did way back when.
There's a trend, you know, in the world that's, well, there's a Scandinavian system, and they use low tuition, free tuition mostly, but they also have income contingent loans. A student from Norway can come to Madison, and after the loan forgiveness they get for getting a degree is taken into account, they're paying the same as a Wisconsin State resident for a graduate program here in Madison. And so and then it's spreading a little bit. Austria went to our kind of system a few years back and then abandoned it. And Germany just did. Germany has a sort of a state system where it bubbled up from the states. And so they turned around and went back sort of in the Scandinavian direction. So I wonder, you know, this might be a growing trend.
You know, there's a lot of ways to skin a cat, and we're not doing any of them, unfortunately. Just good for the cat, but it's not so good for the rest.
We're just herding cats at this point.
Yeah. It's before, if I may, before we adjourn, I think we'd be remiss to not hear student voices, and we are fortunate to have some undergrads here in the room from UW-Madison's Working Class Student Union. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but if you have any thoughts or any ideas or questions, I'm sorry, Dina, but it's okay to pass, but I thought we have a lot of kind of ivory tower types, and I would like to hear from real kids who are really dealing with these issues right now as we speak.
Well, I guess I can speak specifically to the financial grappling. I'm going to come out right now as having $40,000 in student loan debt, and I'm about to graduate, and I'm terrified. So I think this is really important conversation that we're having right now, and I'm glad that we have some working class students in the room, because I feel like historically we've kind of been excluded, although we've also been the most affected by issues of this nature. I honestly have no. Okay, so actually in 2 weeks from now, we have someone coming to talk about the for-profit industry. November 8th, we're bringing Aaron Califato. He's working class, recent graduate, paying back student loan debt, working in the for-profit industry as a loan advisor, and found himself encouraging students in this kind of predatory lending system to take out more debt and get themselves in deeper, right? And so he is a solo artist performing, and he'll come November 8th at 8 p.m. Excuse me. All right, thank you.
Sorry to put you on the spot, but thank you.
All right, well, join me in thanking the panel, and thank you all for being here today as well.